Good evening, everyone. Today I'll be discussing the contents of week 10, which involves two papers pertaining to finger enslavement. In the previous week, we have looked at finger enslavement in brief, which is essentially the force generation, unintended force generation by other fingers when the intention is to only use one of the fingers or say two fingers. So in case of any finger movement, there are two kinds of uh, uh, the fingers can be described as two separate entities. One is master finger and other is slave fingers. In case of master fingers, there is an intention to produce force, whereas force production in slave fingers is unintended and usually a result of movement in the master finger. So, we will be looking at two papers. One is from the lab of uh, uh, Professor Latash, and the other one is from the instructor of this course, who is Professor Vardhan. So, the first paper uh, kind of points towards uh, the involvement of neural factors in finger enslavement more than mechanical coupling, and the second paper further adds on to that. Coming to the first paper, which is the title Enslaving Effects in Multi-Finger Force Production, published in Experimental Brain Research in the year 2000. So, coming to force enslavement, which essentially is a non intentional or unintentional force generation in the other digits when the attempt is to generate a force in a single digit or a couple of digits. So, as we discussed, there are master fingers and slave fingers, whereas the fingers for which the movement was intended are known as fingers, and the other fingers in which the movement was not intended, but because of the movement in master fingers, there are movement in the other there is force generation in the other fingers, are called as slave fingers. For example, in case of a button press task, uh, say the intention is that the button is to be pressed by the index finger. In this case, index finger is the master finger. And every other force for producing finger is known as slave fingers. Or say you're holding on to this pen wherein the only intention is that you use your index and thumb fingers, but there is also some force generated by the middle ring and little finger. In that case, your index finger is a master finger, whereas the others are the slave fingers. uh, it's it's important to note that thumb is usually not subject to force enslavement, because it has the connections and the tendons uh, that are supplied to the thumb are of different uh, are separate from the ones that are connected to the other fingers. Okay. So, there are three major reasons for enslavement. Uh, Three hypothesized reasons for enslavement. To define enslavement force, it's a quantitative measure. It's something that you can put a number to. It's usually a combined action of several factors, and there are three such factors that are usually hypothesized. One is the peripheral mechanical coupling between the tendons, which is essentially a result of the intertendinous force transmission that occurs uh, between uh, adjacent fingers, or between different fingers, index, middle, ring, and little. So, venous force transmission. This might be due to shear. This might be due to move, due to four a single tendon connected to two different phalanges. It can be due to multiple reasons. The other two reasons are of neural origin. This first reason is mechanical, whereas the other two are neural. So the second hypothesis is that multi-digit motor neurons in the enslavement is due to multi-digit motor neurons in extrinsic flexor and extensor muscles. What it essentially means is that if there are, say, a bunch of fibers that are connected to a given motor neuron, there will be, these fibers might diverge and connect to uh, uh, different digits. They might connect to index, middle, ring. They might connect to all four, and this is essentially what this is essentially the second hypothesis, wherein there are different, uh, a single motor neuron might supply to different digits. There is the third hypothesis, which is essentially diverging central commands, wherein there is a uh, mosaic in the central nervous system that supplies to the uh, muscles in a particular area. These mosaics might have overlaps, and these overlaps might lead to finger enslavement. So, this is the third hypothesis. Now, coming to the uh, first paper, the task is to find the fingertip force measurement in the multi-finger tasks. So essentially, the essentially readings are taken in this case the maximum force was, this is the maximum force generated. So measurements were done uh, uh, in measurements were done such that the maximum force generated was readings for maximum force generated was taken, and then the uh, results were analyzed to find what the enslaving effects were. So the major findings were that the enslaving effects, the major findings from a previous paper in 98 from the same group, were that uh, the enslaving effects are large, they're substantial, they're not very, there are, suppose the force generate, the master finger is the index finger, the force generated by the other fingers is very large, which and the enslaving effects are also symmetrical. The the enslaving effects were larger for neighboring fingers. Suppose the master finger is the middle finger, and so the enslaving effects will be maximum for index and ring fingers. You look at enslaving effect. The enslaving effect for index and ring fingers will be far greater than the enslaving effects for the little finger. Okay, and these are non-additive, so there is some sort of synergism involved in this. So another thing that was observed, that if a task required forced production by two or three fingers, the enslaving effects were smaller than the effects observed in the task where only one finger was finger produced force. So the enslavement in a three finger condition is less than in a two finger condition, is while the one finger condition has the highest enslavement. And uh, the one more finding of this paper was that a neural network model accounted for the observed enslavement effect, uh, that showed that the activation of the FDP and FDS muscles resulted in the force production by all the digits. Okay, now this was essentially the background wherein they saw that the enslaving effects were large, uh, nearly symmetrical, larger for neighboring fingers, and non-additive, and there was occlusion effect observed. Coming to the second paper, coming to the main paper, wherein uh, the they looked at when FDP, FDS, and INT were differently activated. The primary objective of this paper was that when FDP, which is flexor digitorum profundus, FDS, which is flexor digitorum superficialis, and INT, which is intrinsic muscles, which are lumbar, lumbricals, uh, etc., were differently activated. What is the relative contribution of the peripheral and central neural factors in the enslavement effects in multi-finger tasks? For this, they have used this kind of a setup wherein there are tiny uh, hooks on which the fingers will rest, and the force applied can be measured using that, and these hooks are connected to a force sensor, which is a piezoelectric force sensor essentially. These are then connected to these sensors are then connected to a computer. There is also uh, there is also a board that holds the hand in place, and a pin that holds the forearm and the hand in place. So there are these three setups such that the only movement that occurs due to the fingers. Only force generation that is recorded records due to the fingers. So essentially the participant's hand is placed on the slab, then attached to it, and then the forces generated are calculated using these hooks, and further on the analysis was done. So to differentially activate the three muscle groups that are there are three experimental conditions based on the placement of the loops. So these loops were either present in the proximal in this joint or this joint, or just the distal phalange. So the loops can be placed at the middle of the distal phalanx of each finger. In this condition is known as experimental DP. At the this at the DIP joint, or at the PIP joint, prox proximal interphalangeal joint or distal interphalangeal joint. So the task was to press down maximally on the loops with the combination of four fingers, essentially the max force, the highest force produced. Index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and little finger. Since the thumb does not participate in enslavement effects, the it is not considered in both of these papers. So there were four different kind of tasks. One finger tasks, wherein each finger was moved individually. So there are four such tasks. Two finger tasks, wherein two fingers were moved and the enslavement effects on the other two fingers were observed. So there are six such conditions. Three finger tasks, wherein three fingers were uh, used. Three fingers, the force in three fingers was looked at. Another four conditions, and then four finger tasks when all the four fingers were looked at. One such condition. So in total there are 15 combinations, three conditions here: EXPDP, EXPDIP, and EXPPIP. So therefore there are 45 experiments. The participants were right-handed uh, males with an average age of 28.9 years. Okay. So the data was recorded. The maximum forces that the fingers can produce was recorded, and uh, the forces of the uh, enslaved fingers was also recorded. There was also EMG to ensure that the participant was following instructions, which is so to not control the other fingers. The EMG was done, so the only instructions apart from the different tasks was to ensure that the that there is no hindrance to the other fingers. The effects that are observed in other fingers are only due to the enslavement effects and not due to some neural input by the participant. So the magnitude of enslavement effect, which is essentially the force produced by an uninvolved finger in a multi-finger task, was expressed as a percentage of the force produced by this finger in a single finger task. And the neutral line was also calculated, uh, which is a condition wherein a supination or pronation torque equals 0. And the moment arm calculation was also performed, both involving and not involving slave fingers. So these three parameters were looked at. And what they saw was that the maximal force was produced by if this is the force of the middle finger, uh, the force in the other fingers, the maximal force was of course in the middle finger, with more force in the with less dependence on little finger and more dependence on right and index finger. Essentially, there is a parallel increase of master and slave force, and there is no perceptible threshold for enslaving force production in all of the 45 combinations that they studied. There were two things that they observed. First was force deficit, wherein the peak forces of individual fingers were smaller than the maximal force generated in the single finger trials. So, if essentially what happened was, if in a three finger trial the force produced by the index finger is less than in a one finger trial the force produced by the index finger. This is essentially force deficit, wherein there is some loss of force in multi finger tasks. The amount of the force is not the same as you would observe in single finger trials. And there was enslaving observed, which was also observed in the previous 98 paper, wherein uninvolved fingers produced a substantial amount of force. So, if at all there is a dependence on the mechanical coupling uh, and enslavement, positioning the loops of the machine at different position will lead to different differences in the forces produced, and therefore maximal force produced, and therefore there will be differences in these conditions. So they recorded the enslavement effects in all the three experimental conditions, and they also confirmed the non-additivity in the enslavement effects, which was previously reported in the 98 paper. And there were also occlusion effect which we looked at here, which is when uh, the enslavement in a three finger condition is less than in a two finger condition, whereas the one finger condition has the highest enslavement. The second paper also confirmed the presence of the occlusion effect, uh, which was seen in two finger and three finger tasks, which is essentially that the forces produced, the enslavement effects produced was less in these conditions than in a single finger task. And it was also observed that the enslavement effect in two finger and three finger conditions were smaller than the enslavement effect in at least one of the fingers. They also saw that the moment arm of the resultant force was smaller when the enslaving force was taken into consideration. And the enslavement effect tended to reduce the secondary moment in the pronation supination with respect to the longitudinal axis of the hand or the forearm. So they finally conclude that the first conclusion was that the enslaving decreases as the distance between the involved and uninvolved finger increases, which is essentially probably uh, looking to a spillover of the commands in the flexor muscle. This is an hypothesis. This is not proved in the paper. The main findings were the enslavement effects among the fingers were invariant with different muscle groups involved. So, comparing between the EXP-DP, EXP-PIP, and EXP-TIP resulted in no differences in the three muscle groups. So, EXP, EXP, and EXP DIP resulted in the same thing. Essentially, the force enslaving among remote muscles suggests that a widespread neural interaction amongst the structures. This essentially points towards disproving the mechanical hypothesis, which was that there are interdependent forces at play which might control the enslavement, and points towards the neural hypothesis, which is either the multi digit motor neuron hypothesis or the divergence central command hypothesis. Also, uh, the multi-digit design of the extrinsic muscle probably favors coordinated multi-finger force production, and this might lead to an this may be expected to lead to enslavement effects. So, uh, the two mechanisms that this particular paper suggests that might lead to uh, enslaving effects is peripheral tendon connections, and multi-digit extrinsic muscles, and plastic changes within the central nervous system, leading to secondary enslavement effects during the amongst the intrinsic muscles. Coming to the second paper, which talks about how posture does or does not influence finger interdependence. One second. So, essentially, what we saw in the first paper is that uh, the effect of finger interdependence is maybe associated with mechanical and neural mechanisms, with the findings pointing more towards neural mechanisms than the mechanical mechanisms. There are other studies that have shown that the finger interdependence can be studied by two ways, either through studying the finger forces, which is kinetics, or by their movements, which is kinematics. So, one of the muscles that are involved in movements in the fingers are extrinsic muscles, which have their bellies in the forearm, with their tendons entering through the with their insertions entering through the wrist joint, and then finally connecting to the uh, phalanges or carpals or metacarpals, whatever. So, the main question that this second paper is asking is, will the mechanical configuration of wrist play a causal role in the finger interdependence? So, how do you change the mechanical configuration of wrist? Essentially, change the wrist posture. Here they have used two, three postures: flexion, extension, and a neutral posture. Okay. So, uh, this is more of a kinematics paper than a kinetics paper, whereas the first one was kinetics, where they looked at the forces generated. This paper looks at the movement between movement and the differences in movement the in different differences of movement between different fingers. They have essentially used three different parameters and then built the analysis on it. The first one is individuation index, or II, which is the extent to which other passive fingers are independent when a given finger is active. Suppose you are moving the ring finger, how less is the movement in index, middle, and little finger. This is the how independent is the movement of ring finger uh, as compared to the other fingers. That is individuation index. Next is a stationary index or SI, which is the extent to which a particular passive finger stays stationary when the other fingers are active. Suppose you are moving uh, the index, middle, and ring finger. You look at the stationary index is essentially for the little finger, wherein if these three are moving, how stationary is the little finger? And then you have the enslavement matrix, wherein finger to finger relationships are studied. This is a 4x4 matrix and because it's 4x4, you look at the enslavement of each of the fingers when uh, the other fingers are moved. So if you tabulate it, it will look something like index, middle, ring, index, middle, ring, and little. This is how the tabulation of the matrix would look like. The maximum enslavement that you would see is 1, whereas the minimum is 0, with 1 being the finger being completely enslaved to the master finger, whereas 0 means complete independence. Okay. So, coming to the focus of the study, which is will systematic changes in the wrist posture cause corresponding changes in the indices of finger individuation and enslavement of fingers? And if there are differences, statistical differences within the wrist postures, which is essentially flexed, three conditions: flexed, neutral, and extended. If there are differences between these three, or even differences between these two, because these two are the more extreme conditions, then mechanical then it uh, hints towards mechanical configuration playing an important role in finger interdependence. And this will further aid into understanding how pathologies different pathologies affect the wrist and the hand. Okay, so coming to the methods that the paper has employed, there are electromagnetic tracking sensor which measure the movement of the individual phalanges of index, middle, ring, and little fingers. So there are the there are three movements of the finger itself: neutral, uh, neutral, extension, and flexion. And there are three wrist position considered: neutral, extended, and flexed condition. Whereas the extension and flexion angles are 30 degrees. And the in particular, the data from distal phalanges was analyzed. So coming to the so essentially the uh, movement was observed, and the the movement was performed either at the draw or the top of the hill or at the bottom of the hill. So there was two tasks in that study: contraction, maximum voluntary contraction movement of each finger, the flexion and extension directions of the metacarpophalangeal joint, and cyclic flexion extension movements at metacarpophalangeal joint with the amplitude of 75%, uh, of the maximum possible flexion extension of an instructed finger as displayed on the screen with a frequency of 0.05, 0.75 hertz. So, and each of these tasks was repeated in three different wrist postures: flexed, neutral, and extend. The the participants were followed in metronome, which so essentially at a draw or at, at a crest or at a draw they will perform the task. And so as a half of this is 0.75, so it's a 1.5 hertz cycle completely if you consider both. If you consider both, this will be 1.5 5 hertz. The beeps are at a frequency of 1.75 hertz. Okay. Now the displacement data was collected and passed through a low pass filter, which was a 3 hertz filter, and then the amplitude was normalized and the enslavement matrix was constructed from the slopes uh, from the linear regression on the displacement of instructed fingers with the other fingers. So uh, the data was collected for was analyzed using a three-way ANOVA. So the data that was collected had different levels. In case of finger, there were two conditions. In case of the finger was either extended or flexed. Wrist was either extended or flexed or in a neutral position. And its middle ring and index, middle ring, and little fingers were considered. The individuation index has a formula like this, which was essentially the extent to which the passive fingers are independent when a particular finger I was active. So if a the term Sij comes from the enslavement matrix, whereas Sij indicates the enslavement of the jth finger when I was active. So say the index finger is active. For the index finger, you will calculate the individuation index. And this is the formula for the stationary index, which is the extent to which fingers J remained stationary when the other fingers were active. So the summation limits are different. Here the summation considers J, whereas here the summation is under I, which is a very minute but a very important difference. So what do the results say? The results on and whole say that the wrist posture does not influence the enslavement indices. Direction of movement does not influence the enslavement indices, but the instructed finger influences the enslavement index. So, which finger is the instructed finger does influence the enslavement indices. So, essentially, the neighboring fingers are more enslaved than the others. If you look at, so the white bar is in neutral wrist position, gray is extension condition of the wrist, and black is the flexion condition. And in this condition, you, if the index finger is active, you are looking at the enslavement index of middle, ring, and little. In case of an active middle finger, you look at the enslavement index of in index finger, ring finger, and little finger. In case of an active ring finger, you look at index, middle, and little finger. And in case of an active little finger, you look at index, middle, and ring. As you can observe, there is a trend. If the so the if index is active, the neighboring finger is the middle finger, which has the highest enslavement index in amongst all of these. Don't compare between an active index and an active middle condition. But if in a single if you look, if just the index finger was active in a single finger task, the middle finger is the one which has the highest enslavement uh, index. Whereas if the middle finger was active, both index and ring fingers have high enslavements. Similarly, if the ring finger is active, middle and little fingers have high enslavement, whereas index finger has very low enslavement. And similar to the index finger, the little finger, in case of little finger, only the ring finger is the one which is highest in enslavement, whereas middle and index fingers don't have that much of enslavement. It was also observed that there is more enslavement for the ring and middle than the index and the little fingers. So there are no apparent differences between the three conditions, however. Between these three conditions, if at all the wrist posture was to control the enslavement, then there will be very large differences these between the neutral, extension, and flexion conditions of the wrist. If you compare the individuation and stationary indexes, you see that the individuation index is highest for the index finger, whereas the stationary index is highest for the index and little fingers. However, the wrist position themselves does not lead to much changes in the individuation or the stationary index. There is something called as an equivalence test, which can be produced to which can be performed to check if the differences between the different conditions is more than the differences between the fingers. And what they found was the average differences between wrist posture was much smaller than the average differences between the fingers, between the individual fingers. And that individuation index and stationary index are not influenced by the wrist posture and the direction of movement, whether it's in a flexion or extension condition of the finger. There could be so essentially there was lack of changes in the enslavement effects, and this could be due to the same effect on all the digits of due to the wrist flexion and extension having the same effect on all the digits of the hand, which is not true because the system is not symmetrical. Or uh, the second possibility is that the wrist flexion extension does not have a significant effect on the function of extrinsic muscles which connect to the digits. The other possibility is that the wrist flexion and extension both have same effect on all the digits of the hand. This would require there to be symmetry across all the fingers, but the connections are not symmetric. There are different connections to each of the digits. Coming to the second hypothesis, which is uh, the wrist flexion extension does not have a significant effect on the function of the extrinsic muscles. It could be that uh, the contribution of the wrist flexors and extension is more towards going to the posture, to going to the flexed or extended posture as compared to movement of the digits. This might lead to the flexion extension not having an effect. So this results further emphasize that there is a neural basis of the finger enslavement, and uh, however these claims need to be further supported by electromyographic recording studies. Also, one of the uh, drawbacks is that the maximum angle was 30 degrees. uh, in higher angles it was not possible to take readings. However, maybe at this orientation the results are like this. Maybe if the orientation changes there will be different results. In these conditions, these are the results that wrist posture does not affect the finger enslavement. If from a clinical standpoint, studying the individuation index and stationary indexes will uh, lead to studying different disorders such as carpal tunnel, where there are known disadvantages in the finger movements, on various neuromotor disorders such as strokes, wherein the digit movement is compromised. Okay, so these were the two papers that were discussed in week 10. I will discuss some of the questions pertaining to week 10. Just let me share screen. Okay. Coming to the first question, which is uh, which is force enslavement refers to unintended force generated in the instructed fingers. uh, Intended force generated intended force generated in the instructed fingers, unintended force generated in the instructed fingers, Unintended force generated in non-instructed fingers or intended forces generated in non-instructed fingers? The answer is unintended forces generated in the uh, right. It's the answer is C. Okay. Coming to the second question, what is finger interdependence? Involuntary movements in the non-instructed fingers where another finger moves. Ability of fingers to move independently without any external influence. Or a specific condition that affects only thumb and little finger or none of the above. Okay. The answer is A. Involuntary movements in the non-instructed finger when another finger moves. Which of the following mechanisms is associated with finger interdependence? Mechanical coupling, neuron mechanisms, both A and B, or neither A nor B? The answer is correct. C, which is both A and B. Uh, there, there might be intertendinous force transmission, or there can be central processes that control the finger interdependence, or the motor neuron itself controlling the uh, dependence. What were the wrist postures tested in the study, the second study? Uh, the answer is 0 degree which is the neutral, 30-degree extension and 30-degree flexion. What indices were used to quantify finger interdependence? Enslavement matrix, individuation matrix, stationary matrix, flexibility index, mobility index, dependency matrix, strength index, dexterity matrix, coordination index, none of the above. The answer is enslavement matrix, individuation effect, stationary index. The others are used for different to quantify other things that they are not involved in finger interdependent studies. Which of the fingers were instructed for movement in the study? Index, middle, ring, little, thumb, index, middle, ring, and little, index, and thumb. The answer is index, middle, ring, and little. Thumb does not usually is not privy to enslavement effects, so therefore it does not function in case of it's not in studied in case of enslavement uh, papers. How was the finger movement recorded? Using this is in case of the second study. Using electromagnetic tracking sensors to visual observation, using pressure sensors on fingertips, by manual measurements with a ruler. The answer is using electromagnetic tracking sensors. What was the primary finding regarding individuation and stationarity indices across wrist postures? They significantly varied across wrist postures. They were mostly equivalent across wrist postures. Only the individuation index varied. Only the stationary index varied significantly. The answer is they were mostly equivalent. There were no changes between the wrist postures in the individuation or stationary indices. What does an enslavement index of 1 indicate? The passive finger moved maximally with the active finger. The passive finger stays stationary during the active finger movement. The active finger moved independently of the passive fingers, and the passive finger did not move at all. It's the first, the passive fingers moved maximally with the active finger. If the enslavement index is 0, then the passive finger essentially stays stationary during the movement, during the active finger movement. How were the enslavement indices affected by the direction of the active finger movement? Significantly affected, non affected, only affected during extension movement, on only affected during flexion movement. No, the answer is not affected. Uh, by direction of active finger movement, I mean flexion or extension of the finger itself, of the distal phalanges. The flexion extension of the distal phalanges did not affect the direction, did not affect the enslavement indices. Which finger was found to be most independent based on the individuation index, middle, uh, index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and little finger? The answer is index finger. It had the lowest in. It has the had the highest individuation index in the graph as compared to the other fingers. What was the effect of wrist posture on the stationarity index? Significant changes were observed. No significant changes were observed. Only significant in the extension wrist posture, or only significant in the flexion wrist posture? The answer is no significant changes were observed. According to results from Chakrabavi et al., the causes of finger enslavement are primarily mechanical causes, primarily neural causes, both neural and mechanical causes equally, neither neural or nor mechanical causes. The answer is primarily neural causes. Uh, the wrist posture did not affect finger enslavement, disproving the mechanical hypothesis that intertendinous force transfer might or or supply of one tendon to multiple fingers might affect the enslavement. Which muscles were implicated in finger interdependence due to their long tendons? Intrinsic muscles of the hand, extrinsic muscles of the hand, both A and B, neither A or B. Answer is extrinsic muscles of the forearm. The intrinsic muscles are not long tendons. They originate and insert surrounding the hand. What was not a method used to quantify enslavement? Enslavement matrix, flexibility index, individuation index, and stationarity index. Flexibility index. The other three were used to quantify enslavement in the second study. What was the main purpose of the study? To examine changes in indices due to systemic changes in wrist posture, to explore maximum voluntary contraction of the fingers, to test the strength of finger muscles, to investigate the flexibility of wrist joints. The answer is A. to examine changes in indices due to systematic changes in wrist posture. What is the correct description of the stationarity index? The extent to which a finger remains stationary when the other fingers are active. The measure of how quickly of sorry, one sec. The measure of how quickly a finger can move. The index measuring maximum voluntary contraction. The statistical significance of the movement direction the finger entered. Independence. The answer is the extent to which a finger remains stationary when the other fingers are active. How did changes in wrist posture affect enslavement indices? They caused significant changes across all indices. They did not cause corresponding changes in the enslavement indices. They only affected the little finger. They significantly increased they significantly increased the individuation index. The answer is they did not cause corresponding changes in the enslavement indices. 19th question is the study found no significant changes in the enslavement indices across different wrist postures, suggesting a greater role of dash factors in the finger interdependence, mechanical, neural, psychological, or random. Psychological and random are not part of finger interdependence hypothesis. The answer is neural factors where are probably more play more role in finger interdependence. Which of the muscles were explored in the study for their contributions to enslaving effects? Flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digitorum superficialis, intrinsic muscles, or extensor digitorum communis. The EDC was used as a control of sorts that it does not change. The other three muscles were explored in the first paper, wherein the loops were placed at different positions so that different muscles are activated and then studied. How was the enslaving effect quantitatively measured in this study? By the total force produced by all fingers, by the force deficit in the multi-finger task, by the force produced by uninvolved fingers as a percentage of the maximal force in the single finger task, or by the difference in force production between the intended and non-intended fingers. This question pertains to the first paper. The answer is by the force produced by uninvolved fingers as a percentage of their maximal force in a single finger task. Which of the following was observed regarding the enslaving effect among different experimental conditions? Enslaving effect was only present in tasks involving the intrinsic muscles. Enslavement effect varies significantly across different muscle groups. Similar amplitude enslavement effect was present across different experimental conditions involving various muscle groups, or enslavement effect was absent when intrinsic muscles were primarily used. The answer is C, similar amplitude of enslavement effect was present across different experimental conditions involving various muscle groups. What was the average maximal force that fingers could produce as a result of enslaving effect? 67.5% of maximal force, 73.5, 45%, or 28.9%. This pertains to the image that they had where they jotted down all the forces, and the answer is 67.5%. How did the enslaving effect vary with the positioning of the force application points on the fingers? Wherein the experiment was done for the distal phalanges, for the distal, for the EXP-PIP and the EXP-DIP. These three conditions that were considered. The EE was largest when the force was applied at the distal phalanx. The EE was smallest when the force was applied at the proximal interphalangeal joint. The EE increased as the force application point moved from the distal to proximal. The EE did not vary significantly with the change in force application points. The answer is D. The E did not change whether the force application was uh, amongst the three conditions. Uh, the forces also did not change much in all of the three conditions. The force magnitudes did not change much. What was the key hypothesis regarding the origin of the enslaving effect? It is solely due to peripheral mechanical connections between finger tendons. It originates from the exclusive use of intrinsic hand muscles. It is a temporary phenomenon that disappears with practice. It is due to widespread neural interaction among structures controlling hand muscles. The answer is D. This is the neural hypothesis wherein there are common neuronal uh, connections that might control different digits, or the central area that controls all of these neurons might have overlapping, might have a mosaic of sorts of different command centers. Which of the fingers showed large enslaving effects? Non-adjacent fingers, neighboring fingers, only the index and middle fingers, only the ring and little fingers. The non-adjacent fingers did not have that much of enslaving effects. If you look at the second paper, the neighboring fingers were the one which had larger enslaving indices. What is the role of the EDC extensor digitonium communis in this study? It was a primary contributor to enslaving effect. It was used to measure the force deficit. Its activity served as a control to ensure the subjects followed instructions. It was not involved in the study. The answer is C. Its activity served as a control to ensure subject followed instruction. What conclusion can be drawn about the enslaving effect's dependency on muscle activation? It is unaffected by the by which muscle groups are activated. It depends solely on the activation of FTP and FTS, flexor digitorum profundus or flexor digitorum superficialis muscles. It increases with the exclusive activation of the intrinsic muscles. It decreases when the extrinsic muscles are primarily used. The answer is A. It is unaffected by which muscle groups are activated. Force deficit refers to smaller peak forces in the individual fingers in the single finger MVC trials compared to multi finger trials. Force deficit is actually the opposite. It refers to smaller peak forces in multi finger trials as compared to single finger trials. So this is false. That's it. Are there any questions? Okay. Let me know if there are any doubts. Otherwise, that's all for this week.